Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Chaos at Ferrari over the last couple of days. That does not mean that it's all bad news for the Scuderia. Reports have it their suspension they introduced earlier in the season actually has had to some extent a positive effect on the car. They're able to extract more performance over the last few Grand Prix, and now it's mainly the brakes that are holding back this year's Ferrari car. If they fix that for next year, they're pretty confident their learnings on the suspension will help next year's car be significantly stronger. Are we here again with Ferrari? It's next year's going to be the one, or are they actually onto something this time? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. As always, it is a week today until we go to Brazil for the Brazilian Grand Prix in Interlagos. Used to be the season decider. It was 17 years ago today. The championship decider was held in 2008, rather famously at that circuit. Couple of things to start with. Colapinto, we're now pretty sure, is getting the drive at Alpine next season. Speaking of Colapinto, I did see this. Don't know what you guys thought about it. The makers of this had this in like rapid speed, so I slowed it down a little bit. But it's just comparing drivers of today to drivers of the past. And yeah, depending on the images and the camera work here. Look, does Colapinto look a bit like Senna? I see it, right? I do see it. Some of these other ones I'm not so convinced about. They've got the Leclerc and Bianchi comparison as well, which has been made understandably many a times. There's also this one, which I believe is Francois Sever, who was a French driver from back in the day. I mean, does he look a bit like Gasly? Maybe. I don't know. Do you see that one? I'm not so convinced about that. They're both French, right? I guess they've got that going on. There is this, and this is quite a cool comparison, just because of Prost and Hadjar, right? You know, people have kind of called Hadjar the little Prost and all this anyway, just because, you know, French as well, at least French origin to some extent. So, yeah, kind of an interesting one there. This one I actually do quite like, though, which is Niki Lauda and Oscar Piastri. I don't think I've really seen this comparison before, but actually, I don't know, I kind of see that one a little bit. Anyway, little bit of an aside to start the video. I do have an update on this two-stop race situation. So we saw yesterday that Formula 1 are pretty keen to consider mandating a two-stop strategy during a Grand Prix. The way they could do that would be twofold. They could either mandate two stops, as was the case this year in Monaco, or they could mandate all three compounds be used. That's another option. Now, in wet races, you can probably still do what you want in that scenario. You guys had some very interesting thoughts in the comments yesterday. I think there are pros and cons to this type of idea. I think what makes Formula 1 great from a strategy perspective is alternate strategies, right? Now, two stops mandated opens up some interesting possibilities because teams will have different ideas on when they want to two-stop, especially if the tyres could one-stop. If they're forced to two-stop, they will have different ideas on what compound they start on. You will get alternate strategies, but if you let them race, then currently we every year get at least a couple of Grand Prix where there is a great race between a one-stop and a two-stop, right? Is the two-stop the better one? Is the one-stop the better one? Will he hold on, right? That's a great storyline. And yeah, maybe there's a world where you mandate two stops, you make the tyres very weak in terms of their degradation, and now we're talking about a two-stop versus a three-stop, and the entertainment value of that would be significantly better, I think, than where we currently are. But is that just papering over the cracks, right? So we talked about it yesterday that Formula 1 are interested in doing this. So they talked to Pirelli, and Pirelli, who make the tyres and will continue to make the tyres for some time to come, they are also on board with this idea. You know, it's interesting why Pirelli, would they be in favour or not? Look, they get the contract from Formula 1 based to some extent on whether their tyres are helping the entertainment value of the sport. Right now, I don't think there's many people that are going to tell you that Pirelli are doing a good job. The teams don't really understand their tyres. You've got soft tyres comfortably doing 40 laps. That's a C5 around Mexico. Probably not ideal, right? So I think the fundamental issue here is that if Pirelli made tyres that did what they should do, which I'm not saying is an easy task precisely, clearly it's not. Tyres are still some of the physics around tyres is still very much cutting edge stuff. But, you might argue that it used to be better back in the day. Pirelli have definitely not got it right over the last couple of years. And I think that is fundamentally the problem, right? Because if the tyres did what they were meant to do and the soft and medium degraded in the way that you would expect, with respect to the performance of the tyre, then I think we wouldn't be having this conversation. But Mario Isola from Pirelli says, teams always try to minimise the number of pit stops because they don't care about the show, which of course is true. But like they're minimizing the number of pit stops because the tyres can do it. They don't have an issue in just doing a one stop, even on the soft medium, based on what we've seen at recent Grand Prix. The C6 soft we've had on occasion is so fragile that the C5 is genuinely a quicker qualifying tyre, as we have seen multiple times this season already. So that's another concern that teams have to deal with. In addition to the fact that because the cars are so close in performance, track position is really useful right now. So Pirelli are on board, right? They're down for it. Look, more Pirelli tyres get used, I guess. Probably good for marketing, I don't know. But I know that they have been trying to cut down on the tyre compounds, actually. On the sprint weekends, they actually use fewer tyres than they would otherwise. So maybe that's not the primary thing, but I guess it means that Pirelli are more of a talking point with more pit stops, which is probably for their benefit, as it were, as a tyre manufacturer. What we are doing to try and make something good for the show, I believe that a two-stop is better for the show because you've got more unpredictability, which is true. But as many of you guys pointed out, and I would also agree with at least in part, the unpredictability is that someone might go for a one-stop, someone might go for a two-stop, or even a three-stop potentially. That elimination happens when you mandate a two-stop, but obviously there will be perspectives on this either way. So Pirelli are on board, F1 are on board. It'll be interesting to see where that goes in the near future. They did it for Monaco. Did it solve the issue? No, but it was Monaco, right? Could it make some Grand Prix better? I think yes. Would it make other Grand Prix worse? Probably also yes. Talk about the Grand Prix from now to the end of the season. We've got 4 more. Brazil, Las Vegas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi. There are 2 sprints in there as well. Big few weekends. And we've got to talk about engines, because when we went to Brazil in 2021, Hamilton took the new engine, turned it up to the maximum, and he had a rather unbeatable car from then to the end of the season. Of course, he was driving phenomenally well as well, but yeah, Mercedes cooked with what they did at the end of last year. There have been questions that possibly Ferrari could do a similar thing. I was just mentioning this real quick because we talked about the tyres. McLaren was saying that last year the tyres were a struggle around Las Vegas, and Stella said that this year the tyres don't grain as much. So they should find themselves in a better spot. But speaking of the engines, the Ferrari, they might take a penalty for Leclerc. They could do it this weekend in Brazil. They might not, but they may decide that taking a penalty in Brazil, trying to make a comeback like Hamilton in 2021, then having a rocket ship for Las Vegas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, could be a better outcome than what they are presently doing. Now, to be fair, you put a stronger power unit in the Ferrari, you crank it up to the maximum, you're going to put more pressure on the brakes, and the brakes are an issue for Ferrari right now. Marginally so, at least in terms of additional pressure, but that's something relevant to at least consider. The key point is the McLaren power units, the Red Bull power units, the Mercedes power units, they are all very near their limitations. They've taken all that they can this year. They have a pool of engines that they will still get to draw from, but they won't want to take any penalties, right? So all of the top 5 drivers in the championship have maxed out their power unit components. We've got 4 races and 2 sprints left. That is going to be challenging on the elements, on the penalties, potentially, whether you take one. So Ferrari are kind of with maybe the easiest decision here, maybe Mercedes as well to a certain degree, but they're not in the world championship fight for the drivers, so they can afford, if they want to say, all right, Charles, let's maybe sacrifice this weekend, and then in Las Vegas you can really give it a go. That's one option. Piastri, Norris, Verstappen, certainly not going to want to do that. The advantage, if anyone has one out of that trio, is Max Verstappen, because of what happened in Austria, where Antonelli took him out on the first lap. His mileage has been reduced by about 300k, so which is relatively significant, right? Like his power unit has, in terms of his overall pool of power unit options, relatively significantly less mileage than some of his direct rivals. Now, of course, Norris, Piastri will expect that because they will have calculated the amount of laps they will have to do. Okay, Norris lost a few laps at the end of Zandvoort, but that's not making a massive amount of difference. And of course, it was a mechanical issue for his car anyway. But for Max, that maybe means they can run his power units with a couple of percentage points more power than the McLarens over the next couple of rounds. It's not going to be anything massively substantial, but with 4 races and a sprint, or 4 races, 2 sprints, it is a challenge to get these engines to the end of the season. Verstappen has a little bit of an extra thing in hand there. Now, this is also true, of course, for Piastri in Azerbaijan, impacting his power unit's wear and tear. So if anyone's at a most disadvantage here, it's probably Lando, right? Because he's done the most mileage out of the respective drivers. But also he's probably driving the best, at least out of the 2 McLaren boys right now. He's got the momentum in his favour. the disadvantage in terms of where they might have to run his power unit would be relatively insignificant, I would imagine, compared to where Verstappen and Piastri are. But it is still something interesting worth keeping an eye on from now to the end of the season. Those Grand Prix, Sao Paulo, Las Vegas, Qatar, all coming up this month. It's a Brazil sprint race, it's a Qatar sprint race, and then Las Vegas is most certainly rather a power circuit. Ferrari did pretty well around these tracks last year. This time last year, the SF24 was in a rather good position. A year on, a very different story. But as I said at the start of the video, it's not all bad news for Ferrari. We know that there's been talk over the last few days. If Ferrari don't deliver next year, Leclerc might want to be out the door. Hamilton might want to be out the door as well. He might get pushed out the door. There's talk about Behrman. There was some talk about Russell. There's been some drama over the last couple of days. The point is that ideally Ferrari would not like that to happen. As I say, it was 17 years ago where Ferrari lost to Hamilton at the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix in that absolutely remarkable conclusion. Funny how it works out, right? Because Massa was very much praised that day for his reaction, his humility, the ability to cross the line first, has done all he could do, hoping that Hamilton was going to finish 6th. Hamilton overtook Glock at the final corner. That put the end to Massa's title hopes. But the way that he reacted on the day was commended. Of course, what's kind of remarkable is that fast forward 17 years, it's now a different story currently running through the courts. But this is what's happening at Ferrari, because the last couple of Grand Prix, they have made a step, right? They've gone from being kind of nowhere to all of a sudden at least being relevant when it comes to qualifying and when it comes to the race as well. They're a strange team, Ferrari, because, let's not forget Baku, even Singapore, but certainly Baku, there was promise that they were going to look pretty good. We know how good Leclerc is around there. Hamilton had a very good weekend there as well in terms of respective pace. And in the first couple of practice sessions, Ferrari were right there. They were looking like a serious threat for the weekends. Then they just disappeared, right, as everything started to conclude. But the last 2 races, they have become stronger. And there's some talk as to why. So they brought their suspension, right? Earlier in the season, they made that big change. They hoped it would completely change their fortunes. Did it? Not really, right? Things haven't massively improved. The main issue is on the brakes. Now, Leclerc has found a way. Maybe this is to do with the new rear suspension as well, but it does appear that Leclerc and presumably Hamilton as well to a certain extent, they're able to shift the brake balance slightly more rearwards, right? You'll find standard brake balances go between, 55, 58% on the front end. The Ferrari was struggling with that. They found a way to bring that back slightly more towards the rear, and it's meaning that the brakes are not in an awful of a spot as they were a few rounds ago, but still, lift coast is a major factor for Ferrari this year. The SF25 is plagued with problems on the brakes, and yet fundamentally their car is not that sound. We know that this year they changed a lot of the things with regard to the suspension. They were hoping that would fix all their issues, or at least give themselves a chance of beating McLaren. Turns out that's very far from true. They're still second in the Constructors. They may finish second in the Constructors. There was a time it looked like they were going to finish 4th, right? I mean, they were really struggling for a few rounds. Mercedes won in Singapore. Max was winning everything. But now all of a sudden it looks like Ferrari might have done enough. There might even be another couple of podiums on the cards for them as well. That the brake issue has not got better, right? The discussion is that since even last year, the SF24 was struggling with disc management of the brakes. This year, the problem has become simply chronic and is essentially unsolvable. Singapore was especially a disaster. Leclerc was lift and coasting almost whole lap. Hamilton tried not to lift and coast because he was told that he could push, and then once he did, his brakes failed. So it's not a good situation. Now, next year, the brakes are going to be very interesting because the manufacturer Brembo has actually said that the brake designs they're getting from the teams vary quite wildly, because next year, 50% of the power comes from electrical components. If you guys have ever driven an electric car, you'll know lots of the energy recovery comes from regeneration and braking, but you don't brake, you let the engine brake for you and recover some of the energy that you used to accelerate it to that speed. If you make the engine bigger from an electrical side, you increase to a certain extent that effect. So next year, and also regeneration is going to be huge for next year's very thirsty electrical motors. So it's a key point for next year, this regenerative braking with the MG UK. And as a result of that, next season, there are some teams that are going to run very small brakes, right? Apparently, Brembo have received some designs with almost no rear brakes, because they think that a load of the braking is going to be done to such an extent by the engine, basically, that it's not going to be necessary. So that could make Ferrari's problem either better or worse, right? I don't think Ferrari are going to have an issue with if they need a certain level of cooling, if they need the brakes to be at a certain point. It's not like they won't be able to make brakes powerful enough to deal with next year's cars. That problem is actually slightly easier. The issue is, do Ferrari also go very aggressive? Do they go for very small brakes, knowing that they've struggled with this over the last couple of years? So that's one problem they've got to solve. But the main question this year was around their suspension, right? They made the major switch this year to the pull rod front suspension, and that was a key talking point. Now, the rear suspension was also a key talking point too, because they changed the philosophy halfway through the season. But it seems that Ferrari actually believe they've made some progress here. What Ferrari learned in Austin and Mexico removed the many doubts about key choices for 2026. Had the current suspension concept failed to work properly, both the front and rear internal layouts would have to be radically changed. Instead, only elements like the torsion bars and the heave damper, which controls the ride height, will be adjusted, with the SO25's behaviour giving confidence to Ferrari to finalise next year's suspension details. So, look, they changed the suspension quite radically. They did so because they believed that doing so would give them a better chance to beat McLaren. The reality is, if Ferrari didn't take as much risk with their change to the front suspension and the rear suspension to a certain extent this year as well, they probably would have a better car than they do, but they probably would have lost anyway, right? Like, I think Ferrari took a level of risk, believing that it was their only way to beat McLaren. The reality is McLaren nailed it and were practically unbeatable all year. But it does appear that they've changed the rear suspension halfway through the season. Obviously, they've made adjustments to the way they're setting up their car as the year has gone on. And yeah, they're still struggling with the brakes. But if you take the brakes out of the conversation, because as the guys at Formula Uno or Auto Racer now said, the lift coast alone is 30% of the gap. So whatever the gap is between Ferrari and the front runners, if it's, let's say it's a 0.3 of a second gap, a tenth of that is lift and coast, and probably more, to be honest. But they reckon that there's at least a substantial amount of it that is lift coast related, which makes a fair bit of sense. And of course, the brakes just in general contribute to more of that issue. So it's not like the car is fundamentally broken, but from an aerodynamic perspective, it's not as bad as maybe it appears, and the suspension they actually think is not that bad. Or at least they've learned a lot. I think that's the key point. Based on the decisions they've made this year and the fact that it's kind of done what they expected it to do, they believe that they can also use similar design ideas to help with next year's machinery as well. Next year's car is different, obviously, substantially different. The Venturi tunnels are gone. There will still be some degree of ground effect generated by the floor, so controlling that ride height will still be relevant, but nowhere near as critical as it is today. So there will be certain teams, especially Mercedes, be probably pretty keen to get rid of these Venturi tunnel cars. Ferrari, I guess we shall see, but at least there's some sort of optimism coming out of Ferrari over the last few days. So enjoy your thoughts in the comments below. As I say, 17 years on from the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix. Just a couple of things as well to close out with. This is the current championship situation. I don't know if these, I'd like to see the area of these boxes, not really boxes, but just to see if they are equal, like let's say relative to the amount of points. I don't think they are. Max is charging down on Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. It's obviously going to be difficult for him to do so. Max says it's going to be tough. It's a 36 point deficit now to Lando Norris at the top of the championship. But there are 4 races and 2 sprints still to go. And rain may still very much so play a factor this upcoming weekend. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.